I decided to camp in the Black Hills of South Dakota for some peace and quiet. I found a nice spot in a clearing, set up my tent, and started a fire. The forest was calm, and I felt relaxed, ready for a peaceful night under the stars. As evening turned to night, I started hearing the distant hum of ATV engines. It was annoying, but it wasn't too close, so I tried to ignore it. After a while, the noise got louder, and I saw the lights of the ATVs heading towards my camp. 4 riders pulled up, their engines roaring and their laughter even louder. I felt a bit uneasy but tried to stay calm. They stopped near my tent, and one of them, a tall guy with a bandana, got off his ATV and walked over, sizing me up. "Nice spot you've got here," he said with a smirk. "Thanks," I replied, trying to sound friendly. "Just here for a quiet weekend." The others joined him, their eyes scanning my gear. One of them kicked at my tent peg, laughing. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. They weren't just being loud. They were looking to cause trouble. "Got any beer?" another one asked, a big guy wearing a leather jacket. "No, I didn't bring any," I lied. I had a couple in my cooler, but I didn't want to give them any excuse to stick around. "Too bad," the tall guy said. "Guess we'll just hang out here for a while then." He sat on a rock near my fire, acting like he owned the place. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped. If I told them to leave, they might get angry. If I did nothing, they might stay and cause more trouble. They talked loudly amongst themselves, making crude jokes and comments. Every now and then, one of them would glance over at me, grinning. I pretended to be busy with my fire, but my mind was racing, trying to figure out how to get them to leave without things getting worse. After some time, the big guy got up and started going through my stuff. "Hey!" I shouted, unable to stay quiet anymore. "Leave my gear alone." He looked at me, surprised that I'd spoken up, then laughed. "We're just taking a look," he said, throwing my backpack to the ground. I felt my anger rising but tried to keep it under control. "Please, just leave my stuff alone," I said, my voice shaking. The tall guy stood up and walked over, getting right in my face. "You got a problem?" he asked, his eyes cold. I took a step back, my heart racing. "No problem," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I just want to be left alone." He stared at me for a moment, then turned back to his friends. "Let's go," he said, much to my surprise. "This place is boring anyway." Relief washed over me as they got back on their ATVs, but just as they were about to leave, the big guy grabbed a stick from the fire and tossed it at my tent, setting it ablaze. They roared with laughter as they sped off into the night. I quickly grabbed my water bottle and tried to put out the fire, but my tent was already destroyed. I managed to stop the flames from spreading, but my gear was a mess. I felt a mix of relief and anger. They were gone, but they'd left me in a terrible situation. I spent the next hour cleaning up the mess and saving what I could. The forest was quiet again, but the peace I'd felt earlier was gone. I kept glancing around, worried they might return. Deciding it wasn't safe to stay, I packed up what was left of my gear and started hiking back to my car. The darkness and the sounds of the forest felt much more threatening now, and every rustle of leaves made me jump. I finally reached my car just before dawn, exhausted and shaken. I threw my things in the back and got in, locking the doors. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the ATVs chasing after me. When I got home, I reported the incident to the local ranger station. They took my statement and said they'd look into it, but I don't know if they ever found those guys. One thing's for sure, I won't be camping alone in the Black Hills again. I decided to take a solo trip to the Boundary Waters in Minnesota, needing some time alone away from everything. I had heard it was a beautiful and quiet place, ideal for clearing my mind. I packed up my canoe, gathered my gear, and paddled deep into the wilderness. The first few days were perfect. I didn't see another person, just me, the water, and the trees. I set up camp on a small island, made a fire, and enjoyed the solitude. My days were spent fishing and exploring, feeling more relaxed than I had in years. On the fourth day, something unusual caught my attention. As I paddled back to my camp, I spotted another canoe in the distance. It was odd since I hadn't seen anyone else around. The canoe was headed toward a section of the shore I hadn't explored yet. I didn't think much of it at the time, assuming someone else was enjoying the peace and quiet. That night, however, I heard strange noises, voices low and serious, carrying over the water. I got up to look around but couldn't see anything in the dark. It made me uneasy, but I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just other campers. Still, I kept my knife close by just in case. The next day, curiosity got the best of me, so I decided to check out the area where I had seen the canoe. It was a bit of a paddle, but I wanted to see what was there. When I got closer, I saw signs of recent activity. Footprints in the mud, discarded food wrappers, and the remains of a fire. Someone had clearly been camping there recently. As I examined the area, I heard those voices again, much closer this time. I quickly hid behind some bushes and watched as three men came into view, carrying large bags and speaking in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but they didn't seem like ordinary campers. My heart raced. Something about them felt wrong. Once they were out of sight, I quietly made my way back to my canoe, my heart pounding with fear. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Every crack of a twig sent my mind racing. Around midnight, I saw a light moving through the trees along the shore. It was them. They were searching for something or someone. Panic set in. What if they found me? I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The light moved closer, then drifted away. I didn't sleep at all, just sat there clutching my knife, waiting for dawn. By the next morning, I knew I needed to leave. This was no longer the peaceful trip I had planned. I packed up my gear and got ready to go. As I was loading my canoe, I saw the men again, watching from the shore. They knew I was there. I pushed off quickly, but they jumped into their canoe and started following me. My mind raced with questions. Why were they after me? What did they want? I paddled as fast as I could, but they were gaining on me. Desperate, I spotted a narrow channel and headed toward it, hoping to lose them in the twists and turns. The water was shallow and rocky, making it hard to navigate. I scraped the bottom of my canoe several times, but I couldn't slow down. Behind me, I could hear their voices, angry and getting closer. I pushed myself harder, my arms burning from the effort. Finally, I spotted a small inlet and made for it. I beached my canoe and ran into the woods, trying to put as much distance between us as possible. I hid in the thick underbrush, struggling to control my breathing. They were close now, shouting and cursing. I stayed completely still, praying they wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, their voices started to fade. I waited until I was sure they were gone before making a move. I navigated through the woods, avoiding the main paths, not knowing exactly where I was going, only that I needed to get away. Eventually, I stumbled upon a small ranger station. I rushed inside, exhausted and terrified. The ranger looked at me, shocked by my appearance. I told him everything. He called for backup, and soon the place was filled with law enforcement officers. They took my statement and went out to search for the men. I stayed at the station, too shaken to do anything else. The authorities found signs of the men, evidence of their illegal activities, but the men themselves had disappeared. The officers told me I was lucky to be alive, explaining that the boundary waters were sometimes used for illegal operations, though it rarely affected visitors. The next day, I left Minnesota, promising myself I would never return. The peace I had sought had turned into a nightmare, and I couldn't forget it. I spent a week in the Adara documenting wildlife. My days were filled with hiking through thick forests, snapping photos of birds and other animals. The place was stunning but isolated, and I rarely saw other people. On the fourth day, I set up camp near a small clearing. It was a peaceful spot, with a stream close by and plenty of shade from the trees. That evening, as I reviewed the photos I had taken, I heard a distant noise, the sound of chainsaws. It was strange since I hadn't seen any signs of logging in the area. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I woke up early and followed the sound, carefully moving through the woods. After about an hour, I came across a group of men chopping down trees. None of them were wearing uniforms, which struck me as odd. I took a few photos from a distance, not wanting to get too close. Just as I was about to leave, one of the men noticed me. He shouted something to the others, and they all stopped working, staring at me. My heart pounded as I quickly turned around and started walking away, trying to act like everything was normal. I could hear them talking, but I couldn't make out their words. I returned to camp, hoping they would ignore me, but that evening I heard footsteps approaching. Peeking out of my tent, I saw 3 of the men coming toward me, looking angry. One of them, a tall guy with a beard, called out, "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I'm just taking pictures of the wildlife," I replied, trying to stay calm. "Show us the camera," he said. Reluctantly, I handed it over. As they scrolled through the photos and saw the images of them cutting trees, their faces darkened. The tall man smashed my camera against a rock, shattering it. "You shouldn't have taken those," he said, stepping closer. "We don't need any trouble." "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, backing away. "I'll leave right now." But they didn't seem convinced. They surrounded me, blocking my way out. Panic surged as I realized I was in real danger. I had to think quickly. "I've already told someone where I am," I lied. "If something happens to me, they'll know." The tall man frowned but didn't move. Another man, shorter with a scar on his cheek, turned to him and said, "We can't risk it. She's seen too much." My mind raced as I scanned my surroundings, looking for an escape. I spotted a narrow path leading into the trees. Without hesitation, I bolted down the path, running as fast as I could. Behind me, I could hear them shouting and chasing me. Branches scratched at my face and arms, but I didn't stop. Their footsteps pounded behind me, getting closer. I came upon a steep hill and slid down it, almost losing my balance. At the bottom, I found an old, abandoned cabin. I ran inside and hid behind a pile of rotting wood, trying to catch my breath. Moments later, the men arrived. They spread out, searching the area. My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure they could hear it. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. After what felt like hours, they finally left. I waited until I was certain they were gone before creeping out of my hiding spot. My body ached from tension, and I was scraped up from the frantic run. But I knew I had to keep moving. I grabbed what little gear I could carry and set off in the opposite direction of the loggers. I walked through the night, not stopping until I reached a small town by morning. I went straight to the local authorities and reported everything. At first, they seemed doubtful but eventually agreed to investigate. I stayed in town for a few days, recovering from the experience and waiting for news. A few days later, I heard they had found the illegal logging operation and shut it down. The men were arrested and I was asked to testify. It was a terrifying ordeal, but I was relieved that justice was done. I've since gone back to wildlife photography, but I'm much more cautious now. The Ozarks, I took a solo trip to the Ozarks, craving peace and quiet. I needed to escape from the city, from work, from everything. I packed light, just a tent, some food, and my camera. I drove deep into the woods, far from towns or people, and found a spot to set up camp. It was beautiful, the kind of quiet where you could hear the wind in the trees and the rustling of animals in the brush. The first day was perfect. I hiked, took photos, and relished the solitude. As night fell, I built a small fire and cooked dinner. The only light came from the stars and the fire. I felt a bit uneasy, but I chalked it up to being alone in the wilderness. The next morning, I decided to explore more. I packed some water and snacks and followed a trail that led deeper into the forest. After a few hours, I came across an overgrown path. It looked like it hadn't been used in years, but I couldn't resist checking it out. The path led me to a clearing where there was an old, rundown cabin. Its windows were boarded up, and the wood was gray and weathered. Something about the place made me uneasy, but curiosity got the better of me, and I walked closer to get a better look. Suddenly, I heard a rustling behind the cabin. I froze, my heart racing. A man stepped out from behind the building, dirty and disheveled, like he hadn't seen another person in years. His eyes were wild, and he held a shotgun. "What are you doing here?" he shouted, his voice rough and angry. "I was just hiking," I stammered, raising my hands. "I didn't mean to intrude." "This is my land," he said, stepping closer. "You have no right to be here." "I'm sorry," I said, backing away. "I'll leave right now." But he didn't seem to hear me. He raised the shotgun, pointing it straight at me. Panic gripped me, and I turned and ran without looking back. I heard the shotgun go off, the sound echoing through the trees. I kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get away. The forest seemed to close in around me, every tree looking the same. Behind me, I could still hear him crashing through the underbrush, yelling. I tripped and fell, my ankle throbbing in pain, but I forced myself to get up and keep moving. Eventually, I found a small ravine and slid down into it, hiding behind a large rock. I held my breath, trying to stay as quiet as possible. I heard him above, cursing and shouting. He fired the shotgun again, the sound deafening. I pressed myself against the rock, praying he wouldn't find me. After what felt like hours, the noise stopped. I waited, not daring to move until I was certain he had gone. When I was sure it was safe, I climbed out of the ravine and started limping back the way I had come. My ankle was swollen and painful, but I didn't stop. It took me hours to find my way back to my camp, and by the time I got there, the sun was setting. I grabbed my things, threw them into my car, and drove away as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back in civilization. I went to the nearest police station and told them what had happened. They took my statement and said they would investigate, but I don't know if they ever found the man. I still think about that day, about how close I came to not making it out of those woods. Now, whenever I go hiking, I make sure to stay on marked trails and never wander too far off. I've always had a passion for photography, especially capturing the untamed beauty of nature. So when I got the opportunity to explore the Everglades, I was thrilled. It was just me, my camera, and the vast stretch of wetlands and mangroves ahead of me. I spent the day taking pictures of everything: the wildlife, the plants, and the calm waters reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. The Everglades were stunning, a dream location for any photographer. As night approached, I decided to find a spot for some shots after dark. I ventured deeper into the wild, following a narrow path that twisted through thick greenery. The air was filled with the sounds of chirping insects and the occasional splash of water. That's when I saw them, figures moving in the distance, far from the usual trails. At first, I assumed they were just other explorers, maybe even photographers like me. But as I zoomed in with my camera, I realized they were doing something different. The group seemed nervous, gathered around large crates and bags. They didn't have tripods or cameras. Instead, they were using tools and gear that seemed completely out of place in the peaceful Everglades. Curiosity got the better of me, and I snapped a few pictures to capture what I was seeing. But in my excitement, I must have made a noise, maybe stepping on a twig. Suddenly, the group went still, their heads turning toward me. I knew instantly that I had been noticed. Fear surged through me, and I turned and ran back down the path, adrenaline giving me speed. The sound of footsteps following close behind sent my heart racing. Branches slapped my face, and roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare slow down. Behind me, I could hear their voices, low, urgent whispers telling each other to catch me. Terror gripped me, urging me to move faster, to escape the men chasing me through the wilderness. I took sharp turns, hoping to lose them in the maze of trails, but they were relentless, their footsteps coming closer with every second. I glanced back once and saw their shapes silhouetted against the faint moonlight, closing in. Desperation took over, and I veered off the path, crashing through thick bushes. Thorns ripped at my clothes, and the mud pulled at my shoes, but I kept going, driven by sheer panic. I had to get away, had to find somewhere to hide. My heart pounded, and my breath came in short, ragged gasps. Eventually, I found a small clearing. It offered no cover, but I couldn't stop. I kept moving, straining to hear any sign of the men chasing me. The night was quiet except for the sounds of the swamp, insects buzzing, water softly splashing against the reeds. I couldn't risk staying out in the open. Pushing through my fear, I waded into the cold waters of a shallow creek, moving upstream to try to throw off my scent. The icy water numbed my legs, but I didn't stop, terrified of being caught. After what felt like forever, I stumbled out onto a muddy bank and collapsed behind a fallen tree. I listened hard for any signs of pursuit, but all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. Had I lost them, or were they still closing in? Time passed slowly, each minute dragging on. I didn't move, not even to look around. The adrenaline that had fueled my escape was now leaving me shaky and exhausted. But I knew I couldn't rest yet. I had to get out of the Everglades back to safety. Moving cautiously, I followed the edge of the creek, using the faint moonlight to guide me. Every rustle of leaves made me jump, and every splash of water sent my heart racing. I felt completely alone, vulnerable, being hunted. Finally, I found a familiar trail marker. Relief washed over me, but I didn't let myself relax. I kept moving, ignoring the ache in my muscles and the overwhelming fatigue. When I finally reached the edge of the Everglades, I collapsed onto solid ground, tears stinging my eyes as I fumbled for my phone to call for help. Emergency services arrived quickly, and I led them back to the spot where I had seen the group. But by the time we got there, they were gone, leaving behind only traces of their camp and the crates that hinted at their illegal activities. The authorities promised to investigate, but the fear from that night stayed with me long after I left. I never returned to the Everglades to take photos again.